Hi everyone, Anthony Fantano here, internet's busiest music nerd. Hope you're doing good. And I'm over here to talk a little bit about one of my favorite albums of all time. In my opinion, the best and my favorite album in the Beatles' entire discography. I am talking about their massive and legendary White Album, a peculiar record in the Fab Four's discography in that it's a double album. Stylistically, it is all over the place, covering genres from all over the popular music map at the time and more. I think in a lot of ways kind of expanding the popular music vocabulary with some of the stuff that they were incorporating into their songs, especially on tracks like Obla Di Obla Da and so on and so forth. So recently, a super deluxe remixed version of the album has been dropped, and I was a little hesitant to give it a shot because I do think so highly of the album, and again, love the record, own it myself, got my own old school stereo pressing of the album, and I just love the tunes on the record. I love how much great material the group drops on the listener on this album. Even though it's not a very cohesive listening experience, it's really stimulating in just how varied it is and how fantastic the tracks are from song to song to song to song. Whether you're talking about blatantly rock or pop-oriented cuts on the record, or even the legendary avant-garde sort of sound collage bit Revolution Number 9. And again, kind of skeptical going into this release because I, again, think so highly of how the record sounds and how the record is as is, that how could you even remix it to improve it? And in some respects, I think my skepticism was definitely unfounded because in listening to this new 2018 mix, there are a lot of beautiful and interesting details that rise up through the newer, cleaner sound of this record. Because if there's anything to know about the White Album, it's just how studio intensive this record is in terms of the extra bits of instrumentation and the detail the band are either working in or playing or arranging into these songs, especially on tracks like Glass Onion or let's also say the closing track of the record, Good Night, which in this current mix sounds amazing. The string sections on this track sound fantastic and luscious and gorgeous. The way that they've kind of cleaned and brightened up all the string sections on this cut, it almost sounds like it was recorded in 2018. It sounds like a new bit of production. It does not sound old. It does not have that kind of like as much vintage warmth to it. It has a modern, very sweet and very bright clarity to it that I think sounds wonderful and does the track a lot of justice. So if you are somebody who really kind of appreciates the album for its fine little extra bits of instrumental detail, then in my opinion, this is really kind of a must listen. To bring up Revolution Number 9 again, the sound collage and the panning and the various noises and sounds that come up through that piece are even more overwhelming in this new version than they were in the old one. To go back to Obla Di Obla Da, the bass line and the groove on that track, they're actually like little variations and bits of the bass line that I was actually hearing for the first time in this new mix that I'd never really noticed before. I would say that's also kind of the case for Bungalow Bill as well, which also the cartoony background vocals that play throughout that track too add a lot more flavor and character because they are brighter, they are more in your face, they just kind of just bring more flavor. Of course, there are some mixes and some tracks on here. The songs that are a little bit more stripped back, the songs that are acoustic on here where, you know, how could you really imagine them getting screwed up? Dear Prudence, Blackbird, I'd also say Rocky Raccoon as well. However, that's not to say that there aren't some low points of this new mix, though. I think there are a handful of tracks that miraculously do get a little messed up and end up worse than where they were in the natural imperfection that they might have been facing given the time period in which they were recorded. I'm talking about moments like Why Don't We Do It on the Road, which oddly enough sounds a lot less visceral in this new version. Maybe the bass isn't as heavy, the instrumentation doesn't feel as dense and compact and full as it does on the old school version. And that's like a heavy rock and blues track. It's got to have some girth to it. It's got to have some weight to it. And for whatever reason, in this new edition of the mix, it just sounds a little hollow. I would also say Revolution number 1 has kind of suffered in this new version a little bit as well. It doesn't really sound like the performance. I mean, obviously it's a new mix, so the performance isn't different, but for whatever reason, the way the mix is kind of hollowed out again, it's kind of another hollowed out mix on the record. The performance feels a lot stiffer and like it's going slower than it originally was, which is kind of a really odd thing to experience because Revolution number 1 is a track that to me always felt like really smooth and had a nice, very fluid mid-paced groove to it. And again, this new version, it just seems almost like a little static in a way. And finally, probably my least favorite mix on the entire record is this new mix of Helter Skelter. I do appreciate some of the weird little background vocal licks that are now pumped up into the mix to the point where they're like popping up periodically, really much brighter than they ever were in the original mix, and kind of really overtaking the sound in a way that I guess adds a bit more variation than the original had. But this mix is one of the most hollowed out, one of the most like bass deficient mixes on the entire record, whereas this mix really should have been the most bass intensive on the entire record because it is the most bass intensive on the original. And to me, this new mix of Helter Skelter is antithetical to what the band's intentions were with the first track, with the original mix, because at the time the band were trying to make the most heavy, chaotic, pummeling track that they possibly could. And one of the only ways that they could go about that, given the studio technology of the 1960s, was just to really crank the bass up. Which is why you hear Paul's bass line just clunking around all over the mix. Gung, 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 gung. I mean, there's a lot of parts in that song where the bass is actually just a lot louder than the guitar is, because it's just clunking and banging and just growling away. You know, it's a little overblown, but I mean, that's kind of part of the magic of it. You know, it's a lot like the original mix that Iggy Pop had conceived for Raw Power in a way. You know, like it was just really heavy. It was just really thick. It was like kind of blown out. It was a little messy, but I mean, it added to the character of the track. You know, like in a way, you kind of have to respect the original arrangement of Helter Skelter, much in the way that you have to appreciate what the band were trying to do on Revolution number 9. And the fact that Helter Skelter is just so, thinned out kind of struck me as odd, given that there are other pretty hard rocking tracks on the record that go over pretty well, that actually have a decent amount of bass in the mix. I would say Hey Birthday is an example of that. That's a mix of a hard rocking track on this record that the new version is just really right on the money. So there are a few spots on the record where I do think the mix could have been a lot better, could have been maybe truer to the band's original intentions. But outside of that, if you're a Beatles fan and you love this record, this is a must listen, because it definitely puts a lot of tracks on here in a new light. Especially, again, the tracks that had more instrumental shifts, more layers. Of course, once you go deeper into the deluxe version, you get all of the acoustic demos from pretty much every track on the record, some other songs that didn't make it on the record. You have rehearsal recordings, you have various takes of pretty much every track on the record. And overall, it's like 5 hours of material. So, I definitely enjoyed my listen through to the new mix and kind of perusing different takes of tracks that I liked the most throughout the album. It's really intriguing because not only does this mix put a lot of the instrumental arrangements in a new light, but I feel like these rehearsals also kind of put the band's creative process for this record in a new light too, because there are some takes and there are some rehearsal bits on this thing that are really absolutely terrible. Absolutely terrible. What I'm thinking of is this unnumbered rehearsal of the track Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except for Me and My Monkey, the intro of that track. If you want to hear the Beatles record a horrible song, like a horrible instrumental, Yeah, listen to this because it definitely gives you insight into the band's creative process and kind of hammering these tracks out and sort of shows you that, fantastic ideas don't just friggin' come out of nowhere. They don't just fly into your head and then all of a sudden they're just coming out of your mouth. You got to work on them. They come from a very rudimentary or really even an awful idea to start, and then you craft it into something much better. There are many, many compelling sort of takes and just rehearsal versions of really great tracks on this record. To go back to Helter Skelter, there's a super long, mega bluesy and slow, like 12-minute take of the song that's totally different in vibe in comparison to the original. And there's another much shorter, much aggressive, and way more psychedelic and trippy, and all the sounds kind of bleeding into each other, way too much echo on the vocals version, which I actually kind of prefer to the new mix. But still, to kind of hear the band's creative process on the way to making this record is pretty cool. Also, on top of it, one thing that kind of stuck out to me in the track list over here is we have the track Not Guilty, take 102. It just goes to show how much time, effort, and money the band and their label were throwing at this record to be recording so prolifically to create this heavy and thick and very dense album. It's no joke when people talk about that infamous little recording of Ringo at the end of, again, Helter Skelter on the original record, where he's like, "I got blisters on my fingers," because he was just jamming really hard for one take after another on that single track, and some of the original jam sessions of that song were rumored to be over 20 minutes long. It's actually, kind of a shame that one of those harder, heavier, longer takes of that didn't end up on this record. But, this is a pretty amazing and enlightening deep dive into one of the most interesting albums in rock history. So Super Deluxe, the Beatles' White Album. Do not miss out on this if you are a Beatles fan, even a casual one, because what this record reveals, even though it does kind of offer some missteps on some of the best tracks here, is pretty great. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you very much for watching. Over here next to my head is another video that you can check out. Hit that up, or the link to subscribe to the channel. Anthony Fantano, the Beatles' White Album, forever.